This is the point that I really try to make in many different areas, not just in global warming, that we need to get a sense of priority. We need to start realizing the world is not falling apart, that doomsday is not around, that it's not going to end all tomorrow. And that's important. And I will, of course, try to get back and show you why that's intellectually true. That's important because we need, at the end of the day, to get a sense of priority. Say, what do we want to fix? There are plenty of problems out there. We don't have enough money to fix all of them. If we don't, shouldn't we at least have a conversation about where do we spend them best? And so my image is really, we're unlikely to have that kind of conversation. You're unlikely to engage both customers and the policy areas that you live in that sort of conversation if we all think the world is going to end tomorrow. If somebody comes up to you and put a gun to your head and say, give me your money, you don't stand around and think about alternative views. You know, oh, would I rather buy a toaster or something? You just hand over the money, right? And that's really the point, that we need to get back to start thinking about where do we actually spend the money in the best way. That's what I'd like to talk about here today. That's what I'm going to spend the next about 40 minutes doing. So this really is about global warming. What should we do? This is of course, a conversation that's been very, very much committed around the discussion of Al Gore, and I'm also going to take a starting point with him, not because he's by any means the only one, but perhaps he's the most visible one. This is a picture up here. This is a picture from Al Gore, and I gave a presentation to Congress last year. I'm sure this must be right before he realizes who I am because he's still smiling. But the point, of course, here is to say this is a question that both he and presumably all of us in here are talking about. How do we actually deal with global warming? Well, let me try and just give you 4 main points on global warming and take you through them and give you a sense of why I think we need to have a different thing on global warming. And of course, that's hugely important, not just for us in general, but also for you as an industry, because at the end of the day, you're the guys who will end up having power outages, having more regulatory frameworks, or maybe even more cost to your businesses, and you will have to pass them on, like everyone else, to customers. This, at the end of the day, is really a question about how do we tackle big issues in the world, and how do we make sure that we worry about the right ones first. So let me get to the first point. I would argue global warming is real, and it's man-made. It's certainly partly man-made. I think there's no point in trying to say, oh, it's all a left-wing conspiracy to raise taxes or something like that. And I think we actually gotta say thanks to Al Gore for having put it on the agenda. I'll get back to why we should not just thank Al Gore, but we should recognize that global warming is a problem. We need to say, and I think, again, this is incontrovertible, our best information comes from the UN Climate Panel, the so-called IPCC. This is by no means a perfect panel, but it's the best we have, and it's a lot better than a lot of other things that we have in the world. The likely temperature rise that we're going to see in the world over the next 100 years is somewhere between 1.8 and 4 degrees centigrade. The most likely one, for those of you who know, it's called the A1B scenario. It's about 2.6 degrees warmer by the end of the century than it is right now if we don't do something. This is a considerable amount of warming. This is definitely something that we should be concerned about. The total cost, as I've also pointed out, most economic models estimate that at around $15 trillion. This is definitely a huge amount. This is definitely something that ought to make most of us sit up straight in our chairs and think, all right, $15 trillion, we better get this right. On the other hand, of course, we also need to remember and get our priorities right, get a sense of how big of a problem is this. Well, the net worth of the 21st century is about $3,000 trillion. So we're talking about 0.5 percentage point. That's an important issue, but it's not by any standards the one that we will look back on the 21st century and say, ooh, that was what defined the 21st century. So we need to get a sense of priority. Yes, it is a problem. It's definitely something we need to fix, but we also need to get our sense right. So we need a smart strategy. So my first point is really just global warming is real. It's happening. We need to find a way to deal with it. But we also need to think harder about how to do that. And that leads me to my second point, that there's a huge amount of exaggeration and bad judgment out there. Basically, we're being told that the world is coming apart, that everything that global warming does is bad for us, and that we need to act right now if we're going to have any chance of stopping it. And I would argue these vastly exaggerated claims that we very often hear lead to bad policy judgment. So, yes, We should be aware that there is a problem, but we probably also dramatically over-worry. And that, I would argue, is also something that we should say slightly less thank you to Al Gore for.